Well, I'd like to welcome everybody to yet another Aesthetic Society Emergency Series webinar. We started off doing this. It was like, oh my God, I'm freaking out. That was the first one. And then, a week later, it was like, hey, do we have a webinar on, hey, where's the other bottle of tequila? But now I think we're transitioning. So we're doing this on preparing for return to life. There's a lot of things have changed, and a lot of members have questions about what it's going to be like when they get back to their practices. And so we're going to try to give you some information on that. I'd just like to acknowledge the help of Sientra and partnership with Sientra for these webinars. Really couldn't be done without them. And certainly leading the Sientra part of that is our very own Blaine Hamilton, who's the Director of Medical Affairs and Professional Education. So Blaine, thanks again. And I think Blaine has some logistical comments that he'll share for you.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And thank you everyone for joining today. I think to echo what Bill just said, I'm excited that we're starting to move towards the positive look to coming back to real life. I think we're all a little zoomed out at this point, but here we are, and there's a lot of great information to be shared still as we move forward. So with that, the disclaimer as usual is that the panelists are giving their ideas, not advice. So all this is a best attempt to give you the best information available as of this exact time today. Things may change as they have. As an introduction, I think most people at this point have used Zoom enough to know how to function, but just as a reminder, the functions, if you move your cursor at the bottom left, you have your mute function. It should look like this with a red line through it, and then a stop video function. Something new we'll be doing today is we'll have several different topics, and after each of those topics, I will put out a quick poll. That's a silent poll, so please just answer that poll as it comes out. We're trying to get some data on people's plan for coming back into surgery and what that looks like. You can use your cursor to just move that poll off to the right or out of the way of the slide so you can continue to see the program. But that'll be a really important data to get everyone's feedback on. It is anonymous, so don't worry about your answers there, but they're pretty general answers. Also a reminder that the Aesthetic Society has done a great job of keeping up with all the information and the questions that come through the chat. The chat function is where you can submit your questions and your comments as we go throughout the program, and we have several professionals kind of monitoring that and answering some of that to best their ability throughout. But a lot of that info is captured after the fact and then placed on the Aesthetic Society website directly. So you can go to surgery.org, and then there's a pretty prominent purple banner that says COVID-19. Click on that, and that takes you to all the resources that have been posted on all the questions on previous webinars, as well as the recordings of the previous webinars if you weren't able to make it live. The same thing will happen for this webinar. Within 24 hours, it'll be posted on that website where you can view it, or if you're suggesting your colleagues get this information, that they can view it there. So that's the basic function of this, and with that, I'll pass it back to Dr. Adams.
Okay, thanks, Blaine. So we have a packed program for you tonight, and so we're going to split this up into three main areas. We're going to talk about business management. We're going to have Renee Coover and Bob Aicher address some of those issues that a lot of you are wondering about and have questions about. Go to the next slide, please. And then we're going to have a look at, many people have questions about when are we going to get back to practice? What is the data showing? So we've got Tom Wiener that's going to share some thoughts with us on that. And then next slide, we're going to go into considerations to return to practice. And we're going to have Sandy Roos and Brad Calobrace to talk to us about that. And then to segue onto their comments, we have Ron Khadaran from Simplast, who's going to talk a little bit about the differences between telehealth and virtual consults. Then we're going to have a Q&A with all of you, and we'll try to answer some of the questions on the chat as we're going along, but then we'll have a dedicated Q&A, and then we'll wrap up at the end with just a short comment from our program chair, Dr. Jamil Ahmad, who's going to discuss some of the upcoming educational objectives and plans that we have in the Education Commission for you, particularly regarding getting CMEs, which are something that I think many of our members are wondering about. So anyway, without further ado, Blaine, let's move forward here. And just everybody knows, please mute yourself and also have your video off if you're not presenting, and that will make it better for everybody. So I'm going to start off introducing Renee Coover. She presented before. Renee's with Burden and Adado. Burden and Adado, as you know, have helped many plastic surgeons with a variety of business and legal challenges. So Renee, thanks for coming. And Renee's going to talk to us a little bit about the update on the first, our Family First Act. Renee, thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Nice to be back with all of you. So I know, as most of you know, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act went past the President's desk on March 18th and then actually went into effect on April 1st. And in that 2-week period, there was a lot of uncertainty and some confusion and questions as to what that meant for the act without any DOL regulations to implement the act. And so there was this waiting period to figure out how the act would actually be applied to those employees that want to take a leave, some form of paid leave. So on April 1st, the Department of Labor, DOL, they did release regulations implementing the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which we lovingly now are calling FFCRA. And I wanted to just go over those regulations quickly with you in the interest of time, just to point out some clarifications that were made by the DOL in regard to implementation of that act. If you could go to the next slide, Blaine, that would be great. So when it comes to covered employers and employees, covered employers still remain 499 employees or less to qualify for any type of paid leave under the FFCRA. When it comes to eligible employees, there was a clarification made for what it means to be eligible for leave. And what the DOL decided is that the employee must have been employed by the employer for 30 calendar days. And what does that mean? The clarification came in the form of the DOL saying the employer had to be on payroll for 30 days before actually taking the leave, or if that employee was laid off or terminated after March 1st of this year, that employee has to be actually rehired or re-employed by December 31st of this year to be considered on payroll and to be an eligible employee for paid leave under the FFCRA. The DOL also made a clarification when it comes to the small business exemption. And this was a question that I got over and over from a lot of our clients and on the previous webinars, because I realize a lot of practices are in that small business category. So the DOL clarified that to take that small business exemption, you need to have 49 employees or less, and this only applies if the employee has requested leave for childcare purposes. So in the event that employee cannot work because their child's school is closed or they don't have a substitute for childcare, then if they request leave, the employer can become exempt from providing that leave under that particular classification. To use that exemption, you actually need an authorized officer of the employer to make some determinations. And I won't go into the details of it, but really the determinations are either that that employee is not replaceable, so there's no one else to do that employee's job, or that the expenses of the business outweigh the revenue of the business if that employee goes on leave, or that the absence of that employee is a substantial financial risk for the business because of their specialized skills or their training. One other clarification the DOL made is that to actually elect the small business exemption, the employer has to document that an authorized officer made the determination that it qualifies for that exemption and then retains records in a personnel file and the employer's file to show that that exemption was made. So that was one question that raised a lot of concern, was that people weren't sure how they were actually going to apply for this exemption, and that clarified it. The DOL also came out with, if you could go back, sorry, Blaine, to the DOL also came out with clarifications for the healthcare provider and the emergency responder exemptions. These are both very expansive exemptions, and basically the entire healthcare industry in some form or another are exempt from leave under this act. We anticipated that it would be broad, but what we didn't anticipate is that the DOL would clarify that anyone who is employed by a healthcare provider, regardless of that employee actually provides healthcare themselves, if they're employed by a healthcare provider, they are exempt. The same goes for employees that are employed for anyone that provides medical equipment, medical supplies, testing, diagnostics, anyone that manufactures those testing kits, that has any part of the supply chain, is also going to be exempt from getting leave under the act. It also includes any individual that's employed by any business that contracts with any healthcare institution. So this is an extremely expansive definition for healthcare provider. And then on the emergency responder side, it's also very broad. So it includes military, National Guard, law enforcement, EMTs, 911 operators, public health personnel, emergency management personnel, and public works personnel, and the list goes on. So these are both very broad exemptions, and it basically precludes the entire healthcare industry from being able to take any leave under this act. If you could go to the next slide. So there was also some clarifications when it came to how to actually take leave under the FFCRA and what are the benefits of leave under this act. So the emergency paid sick leave, which we are referring to as EPSL, that is the 80 hours of paid sick leave that both full-time and part-time employees are eligible to take. And the standard that the DOL created for this to apply is if it's a part-time employee that normally works, let's say, a schedule of 20 hours per week, then they are going to get a total of up to 40 hours of that emergency paid sick leave. The emergency paid sick leave can also extend the 12 weeks of what they're calling FMLA plus. So instead of FMLA Classic, which is what we all know as the original Family Medical Leave Act, is now being called the FMLA plus, which is this emergency version of it. So if an employee exhausts all 12 weeks of their FMLA leave, Classic or Plus, then the employee can still use any remaining emergency paid sick leave that they may have. So this emergency paid sick leave in some ways is acting as an extension of FMLA. There is also this idea of top-offs where for the first 2 weeks, for those 2 weeks of emergency paid sick leave or EPSL, the employee has the sole discretion to use either that paid sick leave or employer paid leave that they've received from the employer. The employer cannot actually force the employee to use their paid leave that they've already accrued. And then for the initial 2 weeks that's unpaid under the FMLA plus, the employee can elect to use either employer provided paid leave or the paid leave under the act. And then for that remaining 10 weeks of paid FMLA plus leave, I realize this gets confusing, the employer cannot require that the employee tops off that FMLA plus with any employer provided leave unless both the employer and the employee agree to do that. So it does not extend the absolute ceiling of FMLA plus leave, but it does have some effect on how much of it is going to be paid and what type of paid leave it's going to be. Another clarification that the DOL made is when using leave, the employee, the regulations now say that if there is no work available, and let me just back up, the regulations are distinguishing situations in which there's no work available from those in which a qualifying event actually causes the employee to be unable to work or to telework. So the example is if there's a coffee shop that has to close temporarily or indefinitely due to a downturn in business that's COVID-19 related, it doesn't have work for the employees to perform, and thus it does not have to actually provide leave to those employees. And this would apply even if there's a stay-at-home or a shelter-in-place order. Two more last points. Intermittent leave. In an effort to limit the risk that an employee might spread COVID-19 to other employees, the DOL is limiting the use of intermittent FMLA leave to two situations. One, the employer and the employee agree to use that intermittent leave, and it's limited to when that employee needs that intermittent leave to care for a child. So in making these two conditions, the DOL has slammed the door on the on-site employee's use of intermittent leave for any of the other 5 qualifying conditions under FFCRA. And then finally, the DOL has outlined different employee notice requirements. And I don't think I have that on the slide, but there are different notice requirements depending on the employee's reason for leave. So if that employee needs leave under this FFCRA Act for childcare purposes, then they should give notice as soon as reasonably practical under the Act. But if the employee needs leave for any other reason, if it's COVID-19 related symptoms of COVID-19, the employer can only require the employee to give notice after the first workday that the employee takes that emergency paid sick leave. So, and the employer must actually accept that type of notice, not only from the employee, him or herself, but from any family member or caregiver or responsible party for that employee. So lots of clarifications the DOL has made. I hope that was helpful in making providing some clarity for all of you. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Renee. So now Bob Aicher, everybody knows Bob. He's our full-time attorney for the Aesthetic Society. Bob, are you there?
I am here. I'm waiting.
Okay.
I'm waiting for the host to resume my video.
You can do that yourself. Just go down there on the bottom and click your video, and you'll be able to see that Bob's wearing his Dodger hat, and he actually could have played for the Dodgers, but he elected to work for us and helping us at the Aesthetic Society instead. So Bob, what questions are you getting from people, and make a few clarifications, and then again we'll have Q&A, so not too long, please.
Sure. Well, first of all, go Dodgers. Okay, the number one question is, can I have a PPP and an EIDL loan, both the paycheck and the disaster loan? And the answer is yes. You can have them both, but you can't use them for the same purposes. So I recommend when you go ahead and get that PPP loan approved, you deposit those proceeds into a separate checking account. And out of that, you only pay payroll and the covered expenses, namely mortgage interest, your rent, lease payments, and covered expenses. Once that's exhausted after 60 days, now you can go ahead and use your disaster loan to cover the same expenses. And at all times, you can use the disaster loan to cover expenses that aren't part of the PPP program. So you can use them to restore your inventory. So yes, you can have both of them, but not for the same purpose. No double dipping allowed. I'm getting questions about the Treasury just sent out new FAQs, and so there's some clarifications to the program. Number one, when you're calculating your payroll, you can either use your last 12 months or you can use 2019. Chances are you'll want to use 2019 because chances are in 2020, you had some months with really low payroll. So to get the highest maximum average monthly payments for your PPP loan, you want to use all of 2019. There's been confusion about including independent contractor 1099s in your application. And that confusion is because the CARES Act said yes, the following regulations passed that came out just a couple of days ago also said yes, but they also said no. So the banks are taking the safe approach, and the banks are saying, no, we're not looking at 1099s. Anybody who's getting a 1099, they can apply for their own PPP loan, so you don't get to include that. And finally, the third thing is that when can you get your money? Now, there have been several questions coming in. Can I go ahead and get the, can I postpone receiving the money so as to take advantage of the recovery? You know, postpone those 8 weeks as long as possible. And the answer is, well, yes, you can, except the program might run out of money before then. Now, the Senate today is battling to try and fix that, but there's no guarantee that they will. Chances are they will go ahead and get another $251 billion into the program, raising the SBA program up to $600 billion. You'd think that'd be enough, but you know, the demand, just like for unemployment, has just been a tsunami of unexpected claims. So at the moment, we're just kind of hoping that the Senate will go ahead and fix this. And in the meantime, I wouldn't go ahead and wait, because you might wait too long. You might go ahead and say, okay, I'll wait. And then suddenly the well is dry by the time you show up there, you know, with an empty bucket in your hand. Now, on the good news front, Wells Fargo was lifted. You recall that they did some bad things a while back. And so the feds imposed some growth caps on the bank. And that meant that the bank couldn't write these SBA loans because it would offend the previous regulations. Those growth caps have been lifted. So Wells Fargo now is embracing applications for these SBA loans. And you may have heard that there's also a Main Street lending program just announced today by the feds, an extra $2.3 trillion. Now, where's that going? Not the same place as the CARES Act. This is going into states, municipalities. It's going to be also providing loans to employers of up to 10,000 employees, but they're really focused on the 500 to 10,000 range, because if you're already in the under 500, you can go for a CARES Act. So it's really going for that. Now they still are making it available though. It'll be a 4-year loan, decent interest, but that they're postponing principal and interest payments will be deferred for a year. Now that sounds great. Wow, no payments for a year. Yeah, but the interest is still accruing for a year. So don't be too misled by that deferral. But there is still help on the way, and we're getting on the chat here. We can see that many of our members have applied and apparently are on the cusp of getting funded. So the PPP loan package program does seem to be working.
Okay. Very good. Thank you, Bob. And if you have questions for Bob, please put them on the chat, and he's going to continue to answer those as we're going along. So, okay, so we're going to move. Thank you. We're going to move on to Tom Wiener. You know, the science and data on this virus is literally changing. It's so dynamic. It's changing like hourly, not even daily. But there's been a lot of changes in the past 2 to 3 weeks. So I've asked Tom to come and really kind of tell us about the science and maybe projections for recovery and when we're going to be able to get back to practice. And I thought just to mention, you know, Tom is a colleague of mine, friend, just south in Houston, great guy. For those of you who didn't know, Tom actually solved a problem that NASA had been working on for like 20 years, and he described something called space obstructive syndrome. And I just put his paper here that he wrote a few years ago. So Tom's been somebody that's really analyzed stuff and generated science over his career. So thanks, Tom, and let us know what your analysis is.
Thanks, Bill. And we've got some important information on on this virus. The first case was reported in Wuhan, China, and it quickly spread. The first known case in the U.S. Was in Washington State on January 20th, but that's the first known case. It quickly spread to Italy, despite their early, not lockdown, but travel restrictions. What a lot of people don't know is the travel restriction had a back door. There is such a thing called the Shenzhen countries where no visa is required, so anyone could travel from Wuhan, China to one of the Shenzhen countries and then into Italy without any special restrictions. So that's where northern Italy got hit hard. Likely that this virus was spreading weeks before any of this, and in the United States, the early unrecognized cases were most likely lost in the flu data. The initial response, the world response was somewhat slow with some travel restrictions. U.S. implemented restrictions from China on February 2nd. Then a widespread population lockdown was initiated, most harshly in China, where people were locked in homes and much worse. China quickly came under control, but they delayed and hid information vital to world mitigation and at what cost to the Chinese population. Sweden did something different. They imposed a lockdown of the elderly, those at risk, allowing businesses, however, to continue working. Elementary school children went back to school. High school and college students studied via the internet. They decreased the viral spread and decreased their economic damage. Interestingly, yesterday, the Arkansas governor was describing how he has done the same thing with very good results compared to the rest of the U.S. This virus is transmitted. This is figure 2, please. Next slide. This virus is spread similar to the flu, surface contact, hand-to-face, droplet transmission, but most importantly, what's called an aerosol. The important aspect to healthcare workers is the aerosol aspect because this sticks around in the environment much longer. So in a high aerosol environment, such as the intensive care unit with COVID patients, upper respiratory procedures, including intubation, that's where these younger healthcare workers are getting higher viral load, and the spread really doesn't seem to be much different than the H1N flu was back in 2009, but viral load or viral exposure is the key. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, go back one. I forgot that was 2 slides on there. The data has been sparse and conjectural. Decisions made early were based really on worst case scenarios, such as Northern Italy and New York. However, early data was available from the Diamond Princess cruise ship. This was a worst case scenario very similar to New York. This was an older population, closely confined, poor population hygiene. All of the passengers were tested, 3,700 plus, 17% were positive. Of those who tested positive, the mortality rate was 0.91%. Of those 70 and older, the mortality rate was 7.3%. By contrast, the seasonal flu in the United States, 2019 to 2020, this was the second worst on record, with 36 to 51 million cases in the US, 370 to 670,000 hospitalizations, 22 to 55,000 deaths in the US alone. Worldwide annual flu deaths approached 640,000 people. In 2009, the H1N1 swine flu, 762 million cases worldwide. Next slide, please. The coronavirus, as of April 8th, the US had about 411,000 cases, 14,000 deaths. Compare that to the seasonal flu in the US, 22 to 55,000. Worldwide, coronavirus is about 1.5 million cases so far tested. 87,000 deaths. Compare that once again to 640,000 worldwide deaths by the flu. New York and New Jersey have over half the US deaths. 2 counties in New York State have almost 1/4 of the US deaths. If New York and New Jersey data were eliminated, this probably wouldn't even make the news. Next slide, please. How we look at and interpret the data is affected by where we are, what we're involved with. If you're a doctor in Italy or in New York City working in an overwhelmed hospital in the emergency room or in the ICU, you'd feel that this is happening to everyone in the world. This is also what the media has focused on because the media is Northeast and New York centric. So it's really a phenomenon of not being able to see the forest for the trees and not seeing the data for what it really is. For diagnosis and follow-up, there was, of course, a delay in manufacturing because it takes time to ramp up the testing for viral detection. That's the test that really helped to determine those who were exposed and get an idea who needs to be quarantined. The critical test now, however, is the antibody test, and specifically IgG, which indicates immunity. It's not clearly known how long this takes, but I will tell you, yesterday I found out a colleague of mine had coronavirus diagnosed 4 weeks ago. 3 weeks after that, he was still virus positive. 4 weeks after that, which was just a few days ago, he was virus negative IgG positive. He is immune. Next slide, please. For hospital utilization, this was the real big key. The spike, the surge, the scare was all about hospital utilization. The early problem and fear, and the problem in New York City, was that the flu season was the second busiest on record, as I mentioned. Across the US, flu hospitalization rates were 65 per 100,000. In New York City, the COVID hospitalization rate is 20 per per 100,000. So it's significantly less than the seasonal flu as far as hospitalization rates. Even then, the flu has a vaccine, yet it has a higher hospitalization rate. So you put a small number of COVID patients on top of an already somewhat overwhelmed hospital utilization, then that's really what's going to cause this massive scare. The COVID patients, interestingly enough, are most likely not being tested for the flu, so there may be some significant issues with that. Also to know, in the patient population that we frequently operate on, the 18 to 49-year-old age group, only 34% in the US get vaccinated for the flu. Next slide, please. So the at-risk population, who are they? From the data accumulated, it's definitely the elderly. It's definitely those with comorbid conditions, pulmonary disease, asthma at any age, cardiovascular disease, immunocompromised, obesity. Also, very importantly, smokers and vapors. This is the reason that a few of the younger populations populace has gotten sick and gotten hospitalized, not necessarily died, but hospitalized. The millennial population in the US has a 20% incidence of vaping. Next slide. The treatments, non-specific treatment, everyone's heard of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine with azithromycin. Read about how this actually works. It's actually not even antibacterial or antiviral. It's interesting how that works. Virus specific, the remdesivir and the antivirals. Very important, the Israelis, even though there are many, many companies developing a vaccine, they say 12 to 18 months. The Israelis were doing a study on a viral model based on a coronavirus. They modified it to use the COVID-19, and they anticipate 3 to 4 months they should have this out in the public as a vaccine. Now, aside from all of those things, herd immunity. So in other words, this early exposure before the first case was detected in the United States was allowing herd immunity to develop. Next slide. Everything depends on a vaccine. Everything we talk about, all of this, every Zoom meeting, every closure of our office depends on the development of a vaccine. Until then, how do we get back to work for the public? The elderly and the high-risk groups, including younger populations with asthma, smoking, vaping, those who are ill or have upper respiratory symptoms or test positive for the virus, they maintain isolation. For the younger groups, under 60, 65, healthy population, they get back to work. Kids get back to school with social distancing, with no facial touching, with good hand washing. Next slide. Healthcare workers, this is the one that's really important. How do we get them back to work? For a virus positive worker, they go home until it's negative. For a virus negative worker, an IgG positive, in other words, an immune person, they care for the patients in the highest risk environments, the ICU, during intubations, during head and neck procedures, oral or airway procedures with an N95 mask. For the virus negative, IgG negative person, in other words, the COVID virgin, they can care for a COVID positive patient in a non-ICU setting. In other words, not a lot of aerosol being produced, but they also use N95 masks. For the virus negative, IgG negative, once again, a virgin for the COVID, with the healthcare working having comorbidities, including elderly or smokers, vapors, they care for non-COVID patients using a regular mask. Next slide. For us returning to work, once again, depends on the development of a vaccine. Proper patient selection and proper surgery selection is going to be very important. Now, these are just my thoughts. This is not written in stone by any means. No one over 60 to 65 years old or so until a vaccine is developed. No comorbidities, including vaping, smoking, asthma. No excessively huge cases. And the reason for this is there's some more recent data. As a matter of fact, some of it came out today, showing that there's an actual increased morbidity and potentially mortality just for the fact of being on a ventilator, not because they had to be on a ventilator. So those of you who do the huge facelift with mastopexy, with arm lift, with liposuction, with craniotomy, spending 10, 12 hours, probably not a good idea right now until we get a vaccine in a few months. Pre-op screening of all vital signs, even a low grade temperature gets rescheduled. And will this require viral testing and possibly antibody testing? Maybe. But once again, understand that this is the worst flu season, second worst flu season in history. We don't routinely test for the flu in our patients pre-op. Some are going to argue that this virus is different, but the only difference may be in the length of viral shedding, if at all, because if you look at the data, not the forest for the trees, then you can really understand how this works. For future pandemics, this disaster, if you use it wisely, is going to allow us to plan for future pre-vaccine outbreaks more wisely. Proper isolation of at-risk groups without total population lockdown in order to prevent economic disaster, faster development and release of vaccines and testing. The FDA has proven to be the bottleneck for test and vaccine development in the United States. Clinical testing will need to be shortened with acceptable risk. And my last slide, please. For those of y'all who, this pre-op screening, sorry about that. And so last slide. For those of you who haven't experienced something like Hurricane Harvey, and I'm very near the coast, the thing I learned was everything, Hurricane Harvey, everything was shut down. I mean, the infrastructure was shut down. You couldn't drive because the trees were down. Grocery stores were closed. No one could get to work. The infrastructure was destroyed. Take this time and enjoy just living. Despite the worries and the pressure, you're temporarily insulated from some of your practice responsibilities. Get in your pool, get in your hot tub, open that bottle of wine you've been saving for a special occasion, focus on that hobby you've neglected, sit out back and barbecue with the family. The time I spent during the 2-week shutdown and the complete infrastructure collapse with Hurricane Harvey was one of the most endearing times I've spent in many years. That's it.
All right, Tom. Thanks so much. That was great information. I know we're going to have some questions in the Q&A, but I want to make sure we get our other speakers time to go. So Blaine, let's go to the next presentation. So, again, more considerations for return to practice. Tom talked about the evolving data. You're starting to hear many, many more epidemiologists and experts and even politicians talking about, how we're going to get people back to work. And so Sandy Roos, who is practice development, well known to many of us, has been on these webinars before, is going to address that, and then we'll have some comments from Brad Calobrace. So Sandy, thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Adams, and thank you for letting us wear our favorite jerseys today. So go Cubs! I see Astros and Dodgers represented. So Blaine, can you just put it on my only slide? And so I am going to keep this very short because we just heard some great things from Dr. Wiener, and I know Dr. Calobrace is going to have some amazing things as well. And we're doing a whole series on this in the next week or so, as well as some practice management virtual workshops that we're putting on at Sientra. But I just really want everybody to kind of look at this, and these are some of the things that I really want everybody to start focusing on. Like I said, both Dr. Calobrace and Dr. Wiener focus more on the clinical side, and I do have recommendations for that. But I also want to start making sure that some of the practices are aware of staffing and what you need to do. I think we all understand that everybody's very anxious right now. There's a lot of uncertainty. I have daily calls with my team, and the practices that I consult with, I'm making sure that they're really communicating with their practices. There is, like I said, a lot of uncertainty. People are stressed. And so I really want us to make sure that we're communicating with your practices, but more importantly, like that staff, the first day back, everybody's going to have a different day back depending on what state you're in. I really do believe, I love what Dr. Wiener said, like with Arkansas and Sweden, all these different things. I felt that all along, that there's going to be places that will be, I think, not practicing for much longer than the others. But if your first day back is on a Wednesday, don't make that the official first day that you're seeing patients and working. The only thing I'm really going to stress right now for this one is make the first day, like, I'm not going to say a party because we're not supposed to party, but have it that you bring your staff in and you talk about everything. You bring a lunch in. You really make it so their first day back, they're not just so stressed. I had one doctor say to me, you know what, they've been off for, a month, 30 days, 2 weeks, however long it's going to be, they need to come back and get to work, but their time off right now isn't a normal PTO. It's not a regular time off. I think that practices that made their staff use their PTO through this time period, I think for a person to be off right now with their kids at home and then coming back with all the stress, I'm recommending that you maybe offer some additional PTO that can be used in Q3 or Q4. So they do have some time just to kind of relax. The employees that I see that work the least, that don't do well at work, are the ones that never take time off. They always say I don't need to take vacation. I've seen over the years, the people that are able to take some time off from work, they are much more productive. And I think we need to be mindful of that through this. Again, I have a lot more that we can talk about, but I want to be able to turn the time over to Dr. Calobrace. But the last thing Dr. Adams asked me to mention is I have had some contact with some practices today, and they've mentioned that, and again, this is not, don't say Sandy said, I'm just saying what I've been told is that McKesson actually, they've ordered supplies for their practice for surgery, and they received the supplies and they received their packs with masks, gloves, and gowns. They are limiting it. Nobody's going to be able to hoard it. But again, I've heard it from a few surgeons today. And so it is something you might want to look at. So when you are ready to come back, that you have, you're not hoarding it, but you do have the gear and stuff that you need to do your surgeries. What I don't know is the anesthesia drugs. I haven't heard back on that. So anyway, that's really all I'm going to talk about. I really wanted to give Brad more time. So take it away, Brad.
That's great, Sandy. And I think, again, so much is changing, but 2 weeks ago, the PPEs were a big deal. And I think there's a big backfill now. There's a lot of production that's been amped up in the US, and there's more production coming over from China. So yeah, I think that everything's in dynamics. So Brad's a great friend, great plastic surgeon. He's also a great cook. Brad, I wish I could come to your house and sample one of the meals that you're preparing that you've been telling me about, but give us your thoughts, and I'm sure they'll be very insightful.
Thanks. Yeah. So I resonate with Tom saying, doing things that we couldn't do and just trying to take the best out of what's otherwise a pretty bad time. And so I've been cooking and trying to get back to that. My parents owned a restaurant for years, and so I grew up around it. So I just want to really briefly here discuss with you just sort of some of the ideas as I'm thinking about going back into practice. I have a large non-surgical practice, and I also have operating rooms, and so all the issues, 65 employees to deal with. So I think as you're transitioning back, start to make yourself lists of things that you're going to have to decide about, and it's easier to do it now while you have time. This is definitely evolving. So I just think that I just went through a few things, the ideas of like, when can I start back with my non-surgical services, maybe injectables and stuff, versus when am I going to be able to do elective surgery? When I do elective surgery, who's going to give me the okay to do elective surgery? Is it our societies? Is it my board? Is it my governor? For those ideas. When you transition back, how busy you're going to be? Are you going to use your whole team back? Are you going to transition and sort of bring people in as you need them? I'm expecting I'm going to bring in my spa people before I bring in my OR people, but I may bring them at the same time. And some of that's based on your funding with PPP and other things as well. Also, we got to go back and deal with all the patients we canceled that were on the schedules for the month or 6 weeks. So how are you going to do that? And when are you going to start that process prior to starting back to work? Think about how much before you get to go back to work and actually see patients that you want to start bringing the team back in to do that, as Sandy had just mentioned. As well, how are you going to keep the workplace safe, have a COVID-19 safe environment for your employees? What things are you going to place into place in your practice? And how are you going to deal with employees that are going to come down with COVID-19 and their sick leave and being away from work, and how are you going to report that? I think those are important things that you should consider now and really write down and prepare for that. Next slide. As it relates to patient safety, I think that, it's important to think about some of the things we already were doing, such as the patient questionnaires when they come in, taking their temperatures, adhering to social distancing, as was just mentioned, that we're going to need to do that for much longer. So maybe we need to space our appointments out further from each one, maybe not put people in the waiting room so much, maybe go directly to the exam rooms, continue to really focus on all the universal precautions that we have, including washing our hands a lot, not touching our face, and all those things. The things we've done also, with other than questionnaires and stuff, is we make sure that our customers can see us, that we're cleaning, and that we're cleaning the door handles and the counters. We have little, as you see in the little pictures, we have all around where they can actually put sanitizers on their hands, and we put these little placards on the beds in each room after we've cleaned the room, just like you would in a hotel room, that just talk about the fact this room has been cleaned before you came in, as a nice way to just keep communicating how important that is. Next slide. And finally, for the future, I think one of the issues, that went the wrong direction, yeah. And there, okay, yeah. So as we're returning to practice, then of course is going to be, this is the same slide, doesn't really matter. It's going to be other issues. It's mostly about how you deal with elective surgery. Are you going to need to have special consents? Are we going to need to do some sort of viral testing for the employees? And how are you going to keep your staff safe and your anesthesia team safe? As we mentioned with the aerosols in the operating room, it's going to matter. So maybe, hopefully in future webinars, as these things evolve, we'll have better answers for that. These are the things I'm thinking about. What am I going to do in my practice? We actually do a specialized Clorox 360 electrostatic cleaning once a week in our offices. We're going to have to institute masks and gloves for most of our clinical staff, maybe even all of our staff members as new things as well. And then finally, we're going to continue to grow in our ability to do telehealth, telemedicine, and virtual consults for both our new consults and follow-ups to really keep that social distancing for a longer period of time. So just for all of you, I know that, I'm struggling with all the same questions you are. These are some of my thoughts initially about what I'm going to need to put together as a plan before I ever get to the back to the office. And I hope that in the future, we'll be able to give more guidance and work together to maybe come up with some solutions that will be beneficial for all of us. That's all I have.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Brad and Sandy. And then to segue on to the next comments, Ron Khadaran from Simplast is here. And Ron, Brad mentioned telehealth, virtual consults. Can you make some brief comments on that? I think you want to kind of differentiate between the two.
Yep, and I will keep it very brief because I know we want to get to the Q&A. So there's really two main takeaways that I want you guys to get from this slide. And the first is that telehealth and virtual consultations are not the same thing. So the whole theme of this webinar is looking ahead because we can tell we're starting to get close to the point of having to prepare for post-COVID when the physical offices will be open. In order for you as a business to position yourself to maximize revenue and to also, in a sense, flatten the curve between your surgical versus non-surgical patients, you need to make sure you are using all of your tools at your disposal. So telehealth is a combination of all different types of mediums, HIPAA-secure texting, sharing of standardized videos, sharing of personalized videos, virtual appointments beyond just what we assume as the virtual consultations. Again, I'm going to keep this very brief. We have a number of webinars every week that you can go through, but that's one of the big takeaways, and I'll go more to that in a second. But I want to stress that, when Dr. Calobrace is talking about all of these new little things that you have to start thinking about as a small business owner with patients in this new post-COVID reality of, hey, just something as simple as a sign that says your bed was just clean. The theme that we at Simplast always are going to be harping on is you need to leverage smart technology in a way that's going to separate yourself from your competition. So the telehealth technology in particular is most relevant because of what's going on with this COVID crisis. And this is a way to extend your aesthetic life cycle for not only surgical, but your non-surgical, your injectable patients. That side of the business, which is going to be much more critical, especially in the beginning to get some sort of cash flow. There are a number of tactics that you can and most definitely should be employing. And again, it's also a way to scale and make the most of your workforce that has obviously been impacted in some form or fashion. The only thing I'll say about Zoom bombing is it's not so much about whether you're using Zoom or not. The takeaway here is that from a perception standpoint, because patients and people in general are much more anxious about leaving their house for anything now, they're always going to be questioning it. You don't want to add to that anxiety. So Zoom bombing is a great example of how quickly we as a society went from everyone had to overnight learn how to do virtual meetings for work, for school, for medical purposes. And within a couple of weeks, we've become so sophisticated that we can, just determine that the standards need to be much higher in terms of security and privacy. And I know I got to jump, but just finally, There's no excuse for any plastic surgery practice out there to not be taking advantage of all of these different points that you see here on this timeline. These elements along the bottom are new telehealth touch points that you can and should be enacting in the post-COVID reality that are going to increase your brand's potential for converting new business and extending the life cycle. And at Simplast, we're offering our telehealth component. It's completely free for the first 2 months. There's plenty of options out there besides Simplast, but there's no reason why you should not today have the ability to do true medical telehealth. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks, Ron. Yeah, it's interesting because I think a lot of practices have probably learned a number of things that they're going to continue on as they start operating and seeing patients like they're typically used to. So, Jamil, we want to do a little Q&A. So, are there any questions that you're seeing on the chat that we can dole out to our panel?
Yeah, Bill, I think that, there's some common themes about when to apply. Should I wait to apply? And Bob Akers, said that it's good to apply now. So I think those are the common themes. It's a labor-intensive process to go through all this supply, whether depending on what type of subsidy you're applying for. But I think it's just one of those things like everything else. You just got to plug through it and do the application. Really research. I think the resources we have really distilled what the important features are. So research what the correct subsidy program is for each person in their practice.
Okay, well, I have one question for Tom Wiener. Tom, you talked about the antibody testing. We're aware that there's a few studies that are being done through Stanford University that's going to look at random sampling of populations.
Thermometer. I put it in the meat and it tells me if it's ready yet.
Can everybody mute their microphone if you're not speaking, because it really ruins the whole thing for everybody else? Tom, do you hear my question?
Repeat it briefly.
So I just wanted you to comment on the antibody testing, which is now available. There's a few random sampling population studies that are being done, one in St. Clair, one in LA, and one for nationally, because the whole idea that you mentioned about asymptomatic infection and immunity. So do you see things are evolving? So nobody has the answer right now, and that data will be, some of it will be available in the next few days, I think. But do you see, you made the comment that we don't test for the flu, but where do you see this going? Do you think this is going to end up being a similar situation as the seasonal flu, or what's your input on that?
I actually think that this virus, even though it once again, this is the forest for the trees. This is dealing from the viewpoint of New York City or northern Italy. I have a strong suspicion, because of the hospitalization rates that I mentioned, the flu is over 3 times higher than COVID. I think once a vaccine is developed, and I'm feeling that this Israeli vaccine is going to come on board pretty quick, this virus is going to probably end up being less virulent than the flu, and certainly less virulent than the H1N1. The one thing that we missed out on early on, and the total isolation lockdown in the U.S. and things like that, were that we missed out on the acquisition of early herd immunity. Because that's been shown to shorten the life cycle of all of this. And when I say missed out on the herd immunity, of course, you still have to isolate those at-risk groups. I think the good thing that happened, though, was in reality, because this thing was going on before we suspect it was. This was in the United States, and it was running rampant in the guise of the seasonal flu. I think we were starting to develop herd immunity long before we even saw the first patient.
Yeah, I think it'll be very interesting. And I think probably next week, one of the things that we'll touch on is trying to get more specifics into what types of infection protocols people may want to consider as they're getting back to practice and operating. So thank you for those comments. So the last thing I want to do is I'm going to turn it over to Jamil. Now, many of the members have been quite concerned just with obtaining CME, because a lot of people come to the annual meeting. Obviously, we're not able to have that. Many meetings are not being held. And as you all know, the Aesthetic Society is really, every day, you know, the leadership and Sue Dykema and her team is trying to figure out what we can do for you as members to support you. And so the CME, we have a solution to that. So Jamil, I want you to tell everybody what we're going to do. You're muted.
Thanks a lot, Bill. So as most of you will know, Bill and I have been working doing most of the educational planning for the Aesthetic Society for over 5 years. And in the background, amongst these webinars we've been running and everything else we've been doing within our own practices, we've been really thinking of how to deliver our membership an opportunity to get CME. As we know, many members look forward to coming to the aesthetic meeting every year and getting 25 to 30 CMEs. And that's the big meeting that they go to. So what we've been finally able to do is on Saturday, April 25th, we're going to have a virtual aesthetic meeting. So the aesthetic meeting 2020 at home. What it's going to consist of is 2 parallel sessions. In each room, there's going to be 2 3-hour courses. So in the purple room, we're going to have aesthetic breast reconstruction, followed by facial rejuvenation. In the pink room, we're going to have buttock augmentation, followed by massive weight loss surgery. And these will be live streamed. There's going to be discussions that are going to be very similar to this with the panelists that are going to be live. You'll be able to ask questions through chat. All of these courses will be recorded, and within 2 weeks following the meeting, they'll actually be available to be reviewed. So if you don't get to come on the Saturday, you'll be able to review these courses and collect up to 12 CME credits for them. At the same time, we've also gone out and we are planning for more than 15 1 to 2 hour instructional courses that will get you 1 to 2 hours of CME credit as well. So you can review these. It's just like going on Netflix and pressing play and watching an instructional course for an hour or two and claiming your CME. So in total, we're hoping to give our members the opportunity to collect more than 25, even up to 30 hours of CME credits from the comfort of your own home. There's going to be the whole spectrum aesthetic surgery. You'll be able to register on Wednesday, and through the amazing work of Sue Dykema and her team at the Aesthetic Society, they're working with our partners, our industry partners, to get educational grants to really push the cost of this CME down. And that's going to be a significant benefit to Aesthetic Society members. You'll be able to see on Wednesday what's available and also what the respective costs are. But Bill and I have a good idea of it, and it's pretty amazing what the Aesthetic Society has been able to do for members with this. So look forward to it. Mark off Saturday, April 25 on your calendar, and we look forward to having you participate. And then for everyone also, just want to put in, you know, from everyone on the webinar and Blaine and Sientra, my best friend Bill here is for those of you who are celebrating Passover and also Easter over this week, then have wonderful holidays with your families. It is the best and longest long weekend ever.
So thanks so much, Jamil. And I just would echo his comments. I think when I say that you're going to think this is full throttle, I really mean it. Like, this is going to be, you're going to really enjoy this platform. We've put a lot of research into it, and I think that you're going to find it quite an experience. So, and hopefully you can, you know, get CMEs that you want to get as well. So look forward, or look for further information on this. I want to thank all my speakers and congratulate all their sports teams. We love them all. Again, thanks again to Blaine and the whole team at Sientra for supporting us and allowing us to put on these webinars. And for all of you, you know, again, we're gonna start talking about getting back to practice, some normalcy. We don't know exactly when that's going to be, but we're confident that it's going to be sooner than some of us originally thought. So that's great news. So have a great night and weekend, and stay tuned for announcements about our next webinar, which is tentatively scheduled for next Thursday. So we'll see you then, and God bless.